Hello. I would like to say hello to everybody who's joined us so far today. I see that the count is clicking up. Thank you for attending the MindCORE Summer Seminar Series. This is our second lecture. We will have another one the same time next week. We also have John Truswell coming up on Tuesday of next week. He was actually going to be yesterday, but something came up and we needed to reschedule. So today we're very excited to have, oh wait, let me back up a little bit and just say that MindCORE is the Center for Mind and Brain at the University of Pennsylvania. And we have been in existence for nearly 3 years. And our job is to create connections among the mind and brain community within the campus of the University of Pennsylvania and broader. And so our faculty come from a number of different fields. And today we are pleased to be joined by the linguist Anna Papafragou, who is going to tell us about her work and about her experience, what made her sort of get into this field. So I'm going to turn it over to Anna. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much, Heather. It's great to be here and sort of virtually see everybody, even though I can't see your faces. This is a great opportunity to address you, tell you a little bit about what I do. I wanted to give you a little bit of background about who I am. I joined Penn a year ago, and my lab is in the linguistics department. My work is very interdisciplinary. I study the nature of human language, how children acquire language, and how we use language to communicate every day. I like linguistic meaning, so most of my work is about meaning, the meaning of words and the meaning of sentences. And I'm particularly interested in the way meaning in language connects to human concepts. So my work connects to other work in neighboring domains such as philosophy and psychology, and even maybe anthropology sometimes, and potentially neuroscience, that all have to do with how we represent and use meaning to communicate and even to think. So some of the work that we do involves conversations with children or grown-ups, looking at social aspects of meaning and looking at all sorts of connections to our cognitive categories. We're also very interested in whether the language one speaks affects the way one thinks. And this is actually the topic of today's talk. I decided to get into this field because my background was actually in classics and linguistics. I grew up in Athens, in Greece, and I went into this area studying literature at first and being really interested in language and its nuances. I then went on to graduate school in London. I came to the States. I was actually a postdoc at Penn, working at the renowned Institute for Research in Cognitive Science. That was the sort of father or the mother of MindCORE way back when. And I started looking at some of the issues that I'm going to be discussing with you today back then. Our lab involves a lot of international collaborations, as you can see. We collect a lot of our language and cognitive data all around the world. We have collaborators in Germany, Turkey, Greece, Mexico. We've done work with indigenous Mayan groups. We study kids and work with kids in daycares and museums. We also look at adults and how their language works. And so I would like to personally invite any one of you who wants to talk more about science or life or get involved, or anybody who's curious about the work we do, to get in touch. And I know that some of you, from what Heather said, are interested in grad school. So if you guys have any questions, any general questions about the future or about the particulars of applying or about anything that you think my area of expertise makes me a good advisor for, feel free to reach out. Again, I cannot see any of your faces right now, but I'll be really interested in connecting if you feel that you have something you'd like to discuss. We're also accepting lab assistants and research associates all the time. I know that one of you in the audience is actually already in our lab and is working on a project over the summer with MindCORE funding. Thank you. So I would like to welcome you all, and I'm going to start now the sort of science portion of the talk. Let me share my screen, and we'll get started. All right. So the question that I want to talk to you today about is the relationship about language and thought. How are the two connected? And we know that humans are equipped with complex language. It's a uniquely human trait in a lot of respects. And they're also equipped with complex thinking. We can think very complicated things about the world and other people. So a question that has taken up a lot of, has been addressed in a lot of discussion over the centuries by a lot of different people is whether the two are connected, whether there's a deep relationship between our ability to talk and communicate and our ability to think. There's a classic view about this relationship, and according to this view, thought is a reflection, the structure of thought is reflected on the structure of language. So according to this view, thought comes first and language follows. So language draws from very basic parts of conceptual structure, and these parts are also often assumed to be universal. And the way we acquire language, according to this view, is by mapping incoming language, so for instance, words that we hear, onto concepts that we already have. In language production, people have had very similar views about how language connects to thought. So here's a model about how we speak. This comes from a very famous book by Pim Levelt in '89 called Speaking. And the details of the boxes don't matter, but the very first thing you see in this model is that to be able to produce a sentence, the first thing we need to do is to form a thought. That's what conceptual representation is. And once we have a thought, once we have a message that we want to communicate, then we can go through different processes that transform this message into basically a bunch of words and a sentence, and ultimately a series of sounds if we're speaking in using spoken language. This is a model of language acquisition. This comes from the work of Steven Pinker. And again, you have this idea that to be able to arrive at a linguistic representation, you first need to start with content that comes from perception and cognition. So children are supposed to be forming concepts first, and then categories, and ultimately mapping these concepts onto language. Here's a challenge for this classical view. Languages differ. So things that are appear to be obvious to you from the perspective of English don't look so obvious if you look across the languages of the world. So I'm going to give you just one little example. If you look at spatial relationships, these are things you can observe in the world. So if you think at a whole bunch of relationships that in English can be encoded by on and in, you will find that these relationships are actually encoded differently in different languages. So English encodes the scenes from A to E with on, so that we say cup on the table, band-aid on a leg, picture on a wall, apple on a branch, ribbon on a candle. And then we reserve in for something like containment. So we say apple in a bowl. If you look at Dutch, which is a language that you may or may not know is very close to English in terms of structure and vocabulary, Dutch actually has 4 prepositions for the same array of meanings. So one preposition is used just for, cup on the table and band-aid on leg. You have a different preposition for the picture on wall and apple on a branch. You have a separate preposition for ribbon on a candle, and then you have something like the English in for containment. So this variation has given rise to the question whether, just like languages differ, thought might differ too. And this is a very hotly debated topic, and there's been a lot of discussion on this possibility in domains such as space. That was the example that I showed you, but also color, motion, geometry, navigation, the way we move around in the world, number, and the way we encode objects and substances. So the distinction between sand and sandcastle. So in all of these areas, languages differ. And in all of these areas, people have wondered and done experiments on whether our concepts or thoughts differ as well. an alternative to the classical view in all of this work is that language might actually structure thought as opposed to just being structured by thought. So this is an old idea. I'm giving you here a quote from Benjamin Whorf, who in the 20th century proposed that the grammar of each language is actually a shaper of ideas. So it guides people to form certain thoughts over others. And Whorf famously said that we dissect nature along the lines laid down by our native languages. This is a very interesting possibility, and a lot of future work has tested this. So what I want to do today is think about and talk to you about some work that asks the question whether the language one speaks might affect the way one thinks. So to do that, we will we'll combine different methods, some coming from developmental psychology, others coming from cross-linguistic work. And we're going to think about how language and thought connect. The area we're going to think about is the area of our origins of knowledge, the way we know different things in both language and cognition. So just to give you a sense of the domain I'm going to be talking about, we'll be thinking about how we know what we know. So this is an ability that is central to our thinking and the way we think about our own mental states. We are not only able to form beliefs, but we can also reason about the sources of our beliefs, right? So we know that sometimes we know things because we've seen them. So here we can see these people climb up a mountain, you can see someone crack an egg, you can see someone drink milk, and you can see the rain coming down. But at other times, we know things because we have indirect evidence for them. So here we see in the first picture, we see somebody on top of a mountain, and we can figure out that that person just climbed up. We see a half-eaten cake, and we can figure out the action that preceded this. We see a cracked egg, and even though we haven't seen the action of cracking, we can figure out what happened. And we also see mud on the road, and we can figure out that it rained. In other cases, we can find out things by being told or having indirect evidence. So here's a little Post-it note that contains information. Someone else can tell us that it has rained. And so all of this is indirect evidence about some event that has occurred. As adults, we know that monitoring the sources of our beliefs, whether we have seen something with our own eyes, whether we have figured it out, or whether someone has told us, plays an important role in how we evaluate our beliefs and how we decide whether to change our beliefs and abandon what we think we know in favor of new beliefs. One thing we know from the long line of work in cognitive psychology that has studied this is that we're not very good at monitoring how we have found out about something, right? Monitoring how we know. So one mistake that people make, and I'm sure you make it just like I make it all the time, is we think we have seen things that we have actually not seen with our own eyes, but we have only read about, imagined, or inferred, sometimes only dreamed about. The opposite mistake doesn't seem to occur very often. We also know that the ability to monitor the sources of our beliefs develops in children over a protracted timetable. So the very first source of information that children know something about is perception. So we know that children around the age of 3 understand the connection between seeing and knowing. So for instance, if you have 2 people and one of them looks inside the box and the other taps the box, 3-year-olds know that the person who looked inside knows what's inside. For other sources, the connection is less well understood by children. So the connection between inference and knowledge is understood only about the age of 6. And children only gradually become able to tell you how they found out about something. So to use things like I saw it or X told me. Turning to language, we know that language encodes a source of information using different devices. So in English and in other languages that you may know, these devices are lexical. So we use words, mostly verbs, to encode how we found out about something. So we might say, I saw it rain last night, or I heard from John that it rained last night, or I figured out that it rained last night. You can also say things like apparently or seemingly and so on. All of these encode source of information. Other languages, about 25% of the world's languages, actually use bits of morphology to do this. So they use a different kind of device. So I'm going to show you examples from two different systems, from two languages that have been reported in the literature to have evidentials. So in these languages, you see that very simple sentences like he played soccer or it's bad weather actually come in lots and lots of different shapes depending on the source of information that the speaker has. So you're going to end up adding a little term, which in linguistics is called a morpheme, at the very end of the verb to show whether the information comes from perception, from hearsay, from inference. And in fact, these languages have subtypes of these kinds of inference. So imagine speaking a language like this. This feels very different from what we have to do in English. So the question is, what could it do for the way we think about sources of our information? So here's one possibility. Maybe these little forms that we're going to call evidentials because they mark evidence, these forms could affect the way we think about sources of information in children. And this is a proposal that some people have made. They say sometimes children come to construct concepts through language. So maybe if your language has all of these markers for information source, you become better at reasoning about these concepts. And of course, the same thing can happen in adults. And here's a quote from Benjamin Whorf, who actually noticed that Hopi, a Native American language, has two different that terms for the sentences, I see that it's red and I see that it's new. And of course, the difference is that in one case, I see that it's red, you're talking about something that you can actually perceive. But in the case of I see that it's new, you're talking about an inference. And so Whorf explicitly says that the Hopi speaker will notice this difference between perception and inference more readily compared to an English speaker, because the form of the language accustoms Hopi speakers to make these connections and attend to them. And an English speaker can make these distinctions, but probably with more difficulty compared to a Hopi speaker. Whorf didn't do any experiments on this, so our task is to actually look and see whether we can find differences of an advantage in thinking about sources of information in children who speak languages with these special markers, and also in adults speaking these languages, compared to speakers of, say, English that doesn't mark these sources in the grammar. So to ask this question, we turn to Turkish. Turkish is a language that is relatively easy to study. We have collaborators in Turkey, and I've had a couple of Turkish students who worked on this. And we asked whether marking these sources explicitly in the language through these markers makes you more likely to think about sources of information correctly. So let me tell you something about the Turkish system. It's simpler than the systems that I talked to you a little bit about already. So Turkish in the past tense has two different options. So it has a direct past tense. So I saw that it rained last night. Gets a little marker, D. As you can see, I know you don't speak Turkish, most of you, but this is a sentence in Turkish. And what you need to know is that the verb comes at the end of the sentence. And this little marker comes at the very end, so at the end of the verb. If you don't have direct experience for the event, if you haven't seen the rain, you're going to use an indirect marker. So you're going to use a different marker that means I inferred or I heard that it rained last night. So what is this? And of course, English doesn't have, right, a marker like this. So the question is, what could this possibly do? We know that children in Turkish take a long while to acquire evidentials fully, but at least by the age of 3, they know what is the correct evidential for having seen something versus having figured something out. So the question is, does it make them better at reasoning about these sources of information compared to English-speaking kids? So here's a task that can help us decide whether this is true. Here, English and Turkish learning 4-year-olds have to find a picture that matches a verb. So we give them a verb such as drinking, and they have to pick either a picture that they can see, so a face-up picture, or a mystery picture that is upside down. So when the verb matches the picture they see, they're supposed to pick that picture. Otherwise, they have to pick the mystery picture. Sometimes the verbs match the scene and sometimes they don't. So in the first example, if you hear drinking, you're supposed to pick the picture that you can observe. If you hear something like twisting, you're going to pick the picture that's upside down. In the bottom picture, if you hear a verb like cracking, you're going to pick the visible picture. If you hear a verb like hitting, you're going to pick the picture that is upside down. The thing that we manipulate here, as you can see, is whether you can actually see the event or not. So in the drinking example, you can perceive the event. It's going on in front of your eyes. But in the cracking example, the event is already done, right? So you have indirect evidence. This is an inference case. And so if you still think that cracking matches the picture, you should pick it, right? Even though the event is not seen. Our question is whether children would be able to do this, right? Remember, these are very young children, so it's not obvious that this task is easy for them. And I should make clear that in Turkish, we didn't actually use the evidential for these. We used the form like cracking that doesn't have this very special marker at the end. This turned out to be an easy task for both English and Turkish speaking children. You see now here the accuracy. So they can do this correctly about 90% of the time and about 80% of the time for inferred scenes. And importantly, children in both language groups were equally likely to succeed. And we went on to do a version of this task for to evaluate whether children can understand that others can have differential access to events. So the task was exactly the same, but now there were 2 puppets that gained access to these pictures, as opposed to the child himself or herself. So one of the puppets looked behind the face-down picture, and the other one looked at the face-up picture, and then they put both pictures inside boxes. And the question was, who do we ask, which one of the puppets do we ask to find out more about drinking or to find out more about twisting? So the logic is exactly the same as before, but instead of thinking about your own access to the event, you have to think about what the puppets now saw or figured out. What we find when we do that is that the task is harder. So you see that the bars showing how accurate kids were are now lower for everybody. But crucially, there's no difference between Turkish and English speaking kids. And both age groups can actually do this. So far, we don't see any evidence that speaking a language that has these special evidential markers makes you better at reasoning about how you found out about something. We've done other experiments in Korean. Korean also has evidentials. It has a direct marker, and it also has a reportative marker. That means I heard it from someone else. And even 2-year-olds have been reported to use these correctly. So this is the experiment we did. It's a very simple experiment. We have 2 characters on the scene. We have Donald and Mickey and a box. Donald looks inside the box, and Mickey does something else, which is not informative. So for instance, he taps the box, and we ask children, who knows what's in the box? These are 3- and 4-year-olds learning either Korean in Korea or English in the US. And the correct answer, of course, is the person who has seen, right? In the hearsay trials, the experimenter whispers into Mickey's ear something about the contents of the bag. Here we have a bag that contains something. And the experimenter does something uninformative for Donald, so gives Donald a kiss. So that's nice, but it doesn't give Donald any information about what's in the bag. And again, we ask who knows what's in the bag. And the right answer here is the person who was told. So remember, Korean has an evidential morpheme. It has a little marker signaling source of information that children are exposed to and know by this age. And the question is, would they be better than English-speaking kids in doing this task? And the answer is no. So you see Korean results on the left and English results on the right. One thing you see is that the 3-year-olds in both groups are a little worse than the 4-year-olds, which is understandable. But crucially, both groups are equal. They're very similar in how they do in this task. If you compare this to how much Korean-speaking children know about evidentiality, you find out something interesting. So this is how you test how much Korean learning kids know about these special markers. You have a little scene again where 2 people are supposed to find out about the contents of 2 boxes. One of them looks inside their box, and the other one is told about what's in their box. A set of curtains drops down, and then you hear, there's a ball in the box with one of these little markers. This is a Korean sentence, right? I'm giving you the English translation here. So this sentence contains either a direct marker or an indirect marker that means hearsay. I heard it from someone. And the question is, who said that? So here, if you heard the sentence that has the direct marker, you're supposed to pick the person that looked inside their box. If you hear the sentence that has the indirect marker, you're supposed to pick the sentence with the person who was informed verbally. What you see is that Korean children are about chance in this task, but crucially, they do a lot worse in this task compared to how they do in the non-linguistic task that I showed you earlier that had to do with judging who knew what was in the box. So that tells us that these very young learners know something about their concepts of information sources. They can think about how others find out about different containers and about contents of boxes before they can understand what the evidential markers in their language mean. So that means, just like the classical view predicted, that thought comes first and language comes later. So children know something about these sources of information before they understand how these sources of information are expressed by terms in their language. But what about adults? So far we haven't seen any differences between children who learn languages such as English that doesn't encode evidentiality in grammar and doesn't encode it obligatorily. That's an important thing to also note that I didn't quite point out. So in languages like Korean or Turkish, it's actually obligatory to encode evidentiality. But what if you speak a language such as English or Turkish for many, many years? What if you're an adult that has been exposed to these languages for a long time? Is it possible that even though children are the same, adults who have been speaking these languages for decades are now different? Is it possible that speaking a language such as Turkish, for instance, make you better at remembering how you find out about something? So remember that we said that a lot of research has shown that we forget as adults how we found out about something. We think we've seen things that we haven't. So could it be that speaking a language such as Turkish protects you from making these errors? So I'm going to show you the results from an experiment that asked this question. In the first version of this experiment, we asked English and Turkish speakers to describe to us what happened in different pictures. Some of them showed events that were inferred, so you didn't actually see the event unfold, you only saw the aftermath. So here in the inferred example, you see someone who has just torn off a paper towel. You also see events that are actually seen, so they are ongoing. So you hear somebody performing the event before your eyes, and you have some other events that are fillers. And of course, what you see is that English speakers never say anything about how they find out about the event. They just say someone's tearing off a paper towel. In Turkish, however, people use one of the 2 evidential markers. So for events that they have seen, they use the correct evidential, the direct evidential 77% of the time. And for the events that they are inferring, they use the indirect evidential 64% of the time. Now you can say, this is not very different, right? Maybe we would expect a larger difference. So we decided to look a little more closely into the kinds of things that get encoded with the indirect evidential. And it turns out that there are two kinds of events in Turkish that give rise to two different kinds of marking with the indirect morpheme. Some of our inferred events are what we will call more deterministic. They're closer to perception. Even though you haven't seen the event, what you've seen is actually enough to convince you that you've actually seen what happened. So our example here is a girl who has blown a set of bubbles. You see the bubbles traveling through the air. You don't see her actually perform the event, but you have very strong evidence that this actually happened. So these are events that, even though were classified as inferred, they were actually much closer to perception. And Turkish speakers used the indirect evidential, this is this mush that I'm giving you here, only 48% of the time. The rest of the time, when they were asked to describe these, they used the direct evidential. They basically thought they had seen these events. So these events are more ambiguous. A second class of events are what we're going to call less deterministic. So these are true inference cases. So a paradigm example of this was somebody sitting next to a book that they had just wrapped, and we haven't seen the action. We can figure out that this is what happened because this person clearly has wrapping paper and scissors, so they must have just wrapped this book or other object here that can act as a gift maybe. And so for these more open-ended, less deterministic events, we found that Turkish speakers used the indirect evidential 81% of the time. So there's a clear difference here in how indirect an event can be, and how close to a purely inferential event it is. And that has implications about how people encode it in Turkish. English speakers have very similar intuitions. So if you ask people what happened in each photograph and whether they saw it or they inferred it, they will tell you for the seen events that they have seen them 75% of the time. And then for the other two cases, the inferred cases, they will tell you something which is very close to what the Turkish speakers actually did when they were asked to encode these events in language. So for the more deterministic cases, the cases where the girl was blowing bubbles through the air, half of the time English speakers say, I inferred it, and the other half they say, I saw it. For the less deterministic inferences, the girl wrapping the present, 72% of the time English speakers will say, I inferred it. And so again, their intuitions about whether something counts as an inference or perception are very similar to those of Turkish speakers. And that's what I'm showing you here. But what does that actually mean for memory? What we've just shown is that the way Turkish speakers use their language is actually very close to intuitions that English speakers have about what counts as seeing something versus figuring out something. But does that actually affect how people remember events? So this is what we did to test this possibility. We gave people a memory task, and in that task, we presented them with a set of pictures in a study phase. So these are pictures such as the ones on the left here. So we showed them the picture of the girl blowing the bubbles. We showed them the picture of the girl having wrapped the present. These were pictures of indirect events of different types. So these were all inferred events. And we asked people to remember them. Then, a few minutes later, we gave them a new set of pictures, and we wanted to see whether people would recognize them as pictures they had seen or not. Crucially, in this memory phase, the second phase, we changed these critical pictures. So we converted them from an inferred picture to a seen picture. So now the girl is actually shown blowing the bubbles. And the girl is actually, the bottom picture is shown wrapping the gift. So this is very close to the kind of memory error that the literature tells us happens all the time. So if people, when they saw the first pictures, misremember them as having actually seen the event, they should think that what they saw earlier is what we're showing them now in the memory phase. They should say, yes, I've seen this picture when they're shown the girl blowing bubbles. And they should also say yes for the girl wrapping the present. But if perhaps their language helps them think about sources of information, perhaps they would avoid these errors, and that might be particularly true for the Turkish speakers. The experiment had other stimuli, so stimuli where the event changed. So we had somebody cough, and then the event shown in the memory phase was completely different. So a girl hoovering, and the answer here is no, I haven't seen this before. And we also have events that remain the same, and for these, the answer is yes, I've seen it before. So this is how this works. We show people in the first phase all of these events. These are static pictures, and we display them for 3 seconds each. And then later, we show them the new versions of the pictures, and we ask them to press a button to indicate whether they recognize them or not. We had 2 different conditions. One that I'm going to call the coarse source reporting. So people were supposed to press a key to indicate whether they had seen or not seen these pictures before. And in the specific source reporting, we specifically asked them to say whether they had seen these events, inferred them, or neither. So these are the results. These are what I'm showing you here are the results from English speakers. So this is accuracy. So the higher the bars, the better people do. And I'm splitting the results up by these 2 different conditions, the coarse source reporting and the specific source reporting. The first thing to note is that people make errors. So you see in the 2 bars that I've circled, the 4 bars that I've circled, these are the critical trials, performance is actually around 70% or less. So we see that people around 30% or more of the time say that they have seen things that they haven't actually seen. So they say, yes, I've seen the girl blow the bubbles, or I've seen the girl wrap the present, even though we didn't show them these pictures in the first phase of the experiment. The real question, of course, is whether we see similar errors in Turkish speakers. And the answer is yes. So these are the Turkish results on the right-hand side. And what you see is that Turkish speakers are almost exactly the same as the English speakers on the left. And they also misattribute a lot of things to perception. They think they've seen things that they haven't actually seen. The 2 groups are also similar in what they do when they see an event that has really changed and is irrelevant to the critical items, and an event that hasn't changed. So their performance is globally the same. It's not like one group is better than the other in any respect of the experiment. We also have a more fine-grained similarity between the groups. For the less deterministic inferences that I mentioned, there's no effect of source reporting. The cases where somebody wraps a present, where it's very clear that this is an inference, it doesn't matter whether you're asking people specifically to say whether they had seen this event or inferred it. But for the more confusable events, such as the one of the girl blowing the bubbles, where it's not very clear whether this event was seen or inferred, specific source reporting is harder across groups. So again, when you look at these more nuanced aspects of our finding, English and Turkish speakers seem to be the same. We did a second experiment where we trained people to pay attention to the exact form of the picture we showed them. These changes are very subtle and people may have missed them. So we actually gave them a lot of practice on detecting that something was seen versus inferred. Even so, people's performance does not improve, and people still make errors about 30% of the time. This is a little scary when you think that people in lots of contexts have to really think very carefully about exactly what they have seen with their own eyes, as opposed to having figured something out. So you can imagine a lot of legal contexts and other contexts where specific evidence matters. It is a little scary that even if you try to train people to really pay attention to exactly what they saw versus, what they filled in perhaps later on via inference, they still are not very good at it. So going back to the questions we started out with, we find overall in all of our experiments that the way we think about how we found out about things and about different events is similar across different language groups. So in both children and adults, in all of our experiments comparing people who speak different languages, the way source of information is encoded in language doesn't actually affect the way you think about sources of information in cognition. So in adults, especially, the use of these evidential markers seems to be identical in people who speak a language that marks these markers to intuitions that people who speak, say, English have about what counts as inference or what counts as perception. And so going back to the picture that I started out with, if you think that we start with concepts that we want to talk about and map this content onto language, you get a picture that is very compatible with the results that I presented, which places concepts first and language second. And all of the data that I showed you offers support for the classic view of language and thought, according to which linguistic categories build on shared, often universal, non-linguistic conceptual categories. In fact, if you think about it, the categories that I talked to you about actually tap very basic ways in which humans find out about things in the world. We can look out into the world and find out about things by looking at them. We can hear about things from other people. We can also figure things out by virtue of having a little bit of maybe visual evidence and filling in the rest. It turns out that even animals have access to some of these sources of knowledge. So there's some really fascinating work on how chimpanzees actually know that seeing leads to knowing. So in some experiments that were very similar to the experiments I showed you with children, chimpanzees know that if someone has looked inside a box, they know what's in the box. And if someone hasn't looked, they don't know. Some of these sources of information are also selectively impaired in autism. So in the very same experiment where somebody looks inside a box and knows what is in it turns out that autistic individuals cannot do this kind of reasoning. So they fail this task because, as you may know, people who are autistic cannot think very well about what other people think or feel or see. So going back to the question about language and thought and about, what is universal and what is language specific, we see that even though we do see differences among languages in the way they encode these sources of information, these differences do not translate into differences in cognition. And so we do not think that it's likely that we construct our knowledge about sources of information by a language. Instead, what we find is deep commonalities across people who speak different languages, and those commonalities about how we think about evidence seem to shape the structure and the acquisition of language. We've done a lot of work in other domains. You may say this is just one area of evidence. What about all these other domains that we started out with? What about space? What about color? What about motion? What about all these other ways in which languages can differ from one another? I don't have time to summarize these results here for you, but I can very quickly say that this evidence and this conclusion that I have presented you with here actually generalizes to other domains where the shape of our language doesn't seem to permanently shape underlying conceptual distinctions, but it can be used as an additional tool for thinking about the world. But it doesn't constrain our thoughts about the world, either in adults or over development. And I'll be very happy to talk to you about these results in the question period if you like. We've done a lot of work on this with a lot of different languages and a lot of different methods, including eye tracking and a lot of online stuff. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I want to thank a lot of members of my lab and many more that I couldn't quite fit into the slide who have contributed to this work, and some more recent members who have helped me think about these topics. And I'd like to turn to questions.
Just bring us up big again.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually have, we have a quick question, and then we have a really long question from Victor that I might actually bring him on the screen to ask in person. So I don't have to read it. But let's go with the first question from Lily, which is, can autistic individuals use the evidential forms in languages like Turkish or Korean?
Yes, I get this question a lot. It's a great question. And people have begun looking into this as we speak. I don't know the answer to this, but I do know that in general, autistic individuals have trouble using mental state verbs such as think or believe, and they use them less compared to typically developing individuals or neurotypical individuals. This is work by Helen Tiger-Plasberg in Boston with English speakers. And of course, we know that autism is a spectrum, so we can't generalize these results to all individuals with autism. But I think her work points to a starting point towards asking these questions. That's a great point.
Okay, good. Let's see. I invited Victor. And here he is.
Hi, Victor. Hi.
Hi. How are you, Anna?
Good.
Thank you so much for the talk. So this is something that we've kind of talked about at times, but I always think about with the Worfian question, right?
Right.
Is that a lot of these arguments also touch on arguments that come up in social contexts, social political, social cultural contexts about the history of our language, right? Like the ways in which, let's say in Romance languages, if you have a group, even if it's not all male, right, but is mixed in some way of like gender representation, you refer to the group as male, right, typically.
Yes.
So, for example, like the movement to think about using gendering in this way in the language, right? So it seems to me like your work touches on this in this way, but not in another way, which is that perhaps, if we're able to translate these kinds of findings into that domain, would be that language or that addition wouldn't necessarily make you better or worse at using those categories necessarily,
Yes.
right? So, but I guess what I want to ask and maybe like clear up or whatever is, what about the kind of additional arguments that are then made, right? That aren't just about whether we see these categories, but whether some implicit assumptions are kind of communicated and perhaps, reified or, naturalized, and like the way in which we say, like assuming that a scientist is going to be male, the male default.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yes.
So,
yes.
And that I imagine your work doesn't touch on.
No. So that's a great point, Victor. Yes. I completely agree with you. So let me clarify and sort of zoom out a little bit from this data. So all of the data that I showed you ask the question, if you don't have to use language, right? If you don't have to communicate and you're just looking out into the world and processing what it is you see, would your native language still come in online and affect what it is you see, you think, right? How you categorize the world? And by and large, our answer has been no in these experiments. Right. However, this is a different question from saying, if I frame something for you one way or the other linguistically, is that going to affect your decision-making, your thinking, and of course the answer is yes, right? And this is why we really want to make sure that we pay attention to how we frame things, how we, what we emphasize and what we encode, even for seemingly innocent distinctions, such as what used to be the generic he, for instance, in language. And we know that, politicians know this, advertisers know this, psychologists know this. Just to give you one of my favorite examples from this, which is from a long way back, people in the 50s, I think, did this experiment where they gave psychology students a text to read about careers in psychology. And for half of the students, the text had the title Psychologists and Their Work. And for the other half, the text had the title The Psychologist and His Work. Later, people were asked to recall details from the text. It turns out, for the group that got the their version, men and women were equal in responding and remembering the text. For the version that was labeled The Psychologist and His Work, men were better than women. Why? Because we know that if you think something is relevant for you, you're going to remember it better. So even this seemingly innocuous way of phrasing the title actually had cognitive implications about what people remembered. The women were just implicitly and probably unconsciously interpreting this as less likely to affect them. So extrapolating from this, you're exactly right that these kinds of things have a lot of consequences, and we should be very vigilant about our choices there.
And then the only follow-up, which hopefully this is quicker, is just, I guess, it seems like there might be a relationship between those two questions. And what I wonder is, do you see of a way to borrow maybe from your approach to, this more basic question about cognition, any, additional pointers or things that could be borrowed to investigate this bigger question?
I think it's important to keep the big picture, an integrated big picture, right? So I think there is a large difference between thinking about language as a way that frames our thinking and decision sort of online, and thinking about longer terms, potentially stable effects, right, of language on cognition. So the first point, again, we know that the way we communicate things in language, because it relies on content that is part of what we say, affects what people think. If we were all in a room and I yelled fire, all of you would presumably go out, because what I say affected your thoughts and your decisions at that very moment for good reason, right? So there's a very real sense in which what we say affects what we do. That is a little separate from saying, do the distinctions that live in your native language affect your thinking even when you're not communicating? And if they did, my bet is that they would make all of us a lot different from one another compared to what we actually see in some of our experiments.
When you say a lot different,
a lot different in our as cognitive agents.
Right.
So right, if we have 7,000 languages in the world right now, we would have at least 7,000 different ways of thinking about the world, right? And so from our experiments, it looks as the linguistic differences that we see across languages do not immediately translate to cognitive differences. So I think it's important to keep, both of these perspectives in mind when they're not incompatible. They are a little different from each other, but I think they tell a different story in terms of what language does in the moment and by virtue of communicating information, and what language does potentially long term.
Thank you very much.
I hope that helped.
Yeah, that helped me. Thank you.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, we're coming up on time. Let's see if there's any other questions that anybody would like to just post in the comments. We have 5 minutes. I actually have a question, just because something that we've been thinking about a lot lately with our current lockdown status. So what is the status of your research now? You work with children. So how have you
How's that?
Workaround?
We are thinking about workarounds. We actually have, I'm getting a little echo suddenly, Heather. I don't know whether you hear that. Okay, I'll just go on for a little bit. We have transferred some of our protocols online. There's a movement on behalf of a lot of developmental labs now in the nation to think about ways in which we can reach parents and children in their homes. So we've posted on websites that invite parents to be citizen scientists and participate in research. All our protocols were already adapted to online research, and we were doing a lot of online work with adults. So in some sense, the transition hasn't been as hard. On the other hand, speaking also as a parent, I understand that people at this stage are also a little weary of the online format for longer kinds of interactions. So I think we're all treading a very fine balance here between engaging people, but also burdening them. But there's a lot of opportunities moving forward to create tools that invite parents and children in their natural environment, in their familiar everyday lives, to be actually participants in our studies. So one of our plans actually for the summer, and this could be something that we could liaise with MindCORE about, would be to create longer lasting tools for these kinds of engagements, and creating a sort of connection to groups and parents and people out there who will be participants in our studies in the long run, and that we will want to maintain a longer term relationship with, and bring some of this outside the lab and outside even the Philly daycares and the Philly museums that we would normally go to, and really just like with other online tools, you can really reach a broader range of the population. We can actually do that by transferring some of our developmental work online. So this has challenges, but it also presents opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's exciting.
Yeah.
But also scary.
Yes.
There's a lot of what our days are like now.
Exactly.
Exciting, but scary.
Exactly. But if people have ideas, that would be a great project for some of the younger members of our lab. We have undergrads who really want to pilot this and test this. So this would be a great thing to actually try out on a larger scale.
Yeah, good. Well, I want to thank you again for your, thank you so much for your time today.
Absolutely. I hope people enjoyed this. Thank you so much, Heather, for facilitating this.
Yes.
Everybody have a great day. Take care.
I'll close you.
Mm-hmm.
And sorry.
Sure.
I'm just going to give it a few minutes so people can say their thank yous. Thank you, thank you. They're showing up.
Thanks, everybody. I hope I got everybody. Thanks.
All right. All right, thank you again, everyone.